On the 5th of October, 2025, just after dawn, a single electric motorcycle rolled out of a factory gate on Mombasa Road in Nairobi, Kenya. There was no fanfare, no convoy. A rider named Mikael pulled on a helmet, stowed a portable charger the size of a small suitcase, and pointed the front wheel north. His destination was Addis Ababa, capital of Ethiopia, 1,600 kilometers away across some of the harshest terrain in East Africa. The Chalbi Desert, the high plateau north of Moyale, a country whose petrol stations, dead reliable for 2,000 kilometers, would give way to a landscape of solar arrays, farm compounds, and any wall socket a rider could sweet-talk his way into. The motorcycle he was riding had been designed in Kenya, assembled in Kenya, financed in part by boda taxi drivers in Nairobi paying for it in daily installments. Its battery pack was Chinese. Its idea was not. This is the story of two Swedish engineering students who moved to Nairobi in 2017, refused to import anything, and quietly built the only African electric vehicle company that actually manufactures. Hi again, welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Rome Electric. This is the company that decided the future of African electric transport had to be built in Africa. Wire by wire, wheel by wheel, and then rode a single motorcycle 1,600 kilometers across a continent to prove it. Let's get into it. The origin of Rome Electric does not begin in Africa. It begins in Sweden in the autumn of 2016 at Linköping University, a research institution on the flat plains of Östergötland, about 200 kilometers south of Stockholm. 3 engineering students, enrolled in a master's program in energy, environment, and management, had been given what looked like a simple research question: where in the world could electric mobility deliver the biggest impact? Their names were Filip Lövström, Mikael Gånge, and Filip. Their answer, after months of research, was not California, not China, not Norway. Their answer was Kenya. And the reasoning went like this. Kenya had one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa. Its transportation grid ran overwhelmingly on second-hand vehicles imported from Japan, at enormous cost to the national fossil fuel bill. Its vehicle fleet was small enough that a switch to electric would not strand a huge installed base, and, most importantly, no one else was seriously building for that market. It was, in venture terms, open water. In 2017, Filip Lövström and Mikael Gånge moved to Nairobi. Not as venture-backed founders, not as executives with a slick launch plan. They moved as students turned mechanics. Filip, the third member of the founding trio, would exit the company early. The 2 remaining Swedes rented an unremarkable warehouse in Nairobi. They gave their company an unremarkable Latin name, Opibus, meaning roughly with resources. And they started work. The first business was not motorcycles. The first business was safari vehicles. Opibus took internal combustion Toyota Land Cruisers, the workhorses of Kenya's tourist industry, ripped out their diesel engines and converted them into fully electric drivetrains. For a high-end safari camp operating deep inside the Masai Mara, this was a beautiful pitch. The vehicles ran quiet, which meant closer wildlife encounters. They emitted nothing, which meant cleaner air inside the reserve. They could be recharged from a solar array bolted onto the camp roof, and they cost about $37,000 per conversion, which luxury tour operators charging thousands of dollars a night per tent could easily absorb. By the end of 2019, Opibus had converted about 10 Land Cruisers, including 3 inside the Masai Mara. Any single one of those conversions could have been a founder's whole career. But that was not the plan. For Lövström and Gånge, the safari business was a beachhead, a way to prove, to themselves and to Kenyan regulators and to eventual investors, that they could actually build things in Nairobi rather than assemble kits shipped from Shenzhen. That proof was the platform on which everything else would eventually stand. By 2020, Opibus was quietly profitable on safari conversions. It was also, by any reasonable startup measure, a boutique business. 10 vehicles a year, at $40,000 a vehicle, is not the kind of business you take public. The founders knew it, and so they started asking the question every successful early-stage company eventually has to answer. What was the largest thing they could possibly become? The number they landed on was 2 million. 2 million new petrol motorcycles were sold across Africa every year. In Nairobi alone, there were more than 200,000 boda taxis. the small motorcycle cabs that carried commuters through traffic no matatu could penetrate. Every single one of them ran on imported petrol. Every single one of them made noise. Every single one of them was mile for mile a candidate for electrification. If Opibus could build an electric motorcycle that cost less to run than a petrol one and financed it in a way a Nairobi taxi driver could actually afford, the market was almost limitless. But convincing that rider was the hardest part. A Nairobi boda boda driver in 2020 netted maybe 500 to 800 Kenyan shillings on a good day. His single largest expense was petrol. His second largest was the loan on the motorcycle he did not yet own. And Opibus was proposing to sell him a new machine of an entirely unfamiliar technology for 180,000 shillings, roughly $1,500. There was no consumer finance product on the market that would fund such a purchase for a rider whose bank statements would never survive a formal underwriting check. The other struggle was capital. Climate technology venture funding in the period from 2017 through 2020 was oriented toward Palo Alto and Berlin, not Nairobi. Opibus's Series A would not close until early 2024. That is a 7-year runway on seed capital and small climate grants in a business that was building physical vehicles in a country where every component had to be sourced, tested, and re-engineered for potholes, dust, humidity, and the peculiar habit of Nairobi boda boda riders of loading their small motorcycles with 2 full-grown passengers, a sack of maize, and a chicken. The supply chain had to be built from scratch. There were no Kenyan suppliers of electric vehicle frames, no Kenyan battery integrators, no wiring harness manufacturers accustomed to the specifications an electric motorcycle needed. Opibus built almost everything in-house: battery packs, motor controllers, frames, bodywork. The pieces they could not build, they imported from China and re-engineered for East African conditions. And they did all of it for years on cash flows from a small fleet of safari land cruisers running quietly across the Masai Mara. In 2022, everything changed. Opibus launched a purpose-built electric motorcycle designed from the ground up for the East African boda boda market. It was called the Roam Air. It was priced at 180,000 Kenyan shillings. Its range on a single battery was about 80 kilometers, on a dual battery configuration 160. It could be recharged at any wall socket in Kenya for about 150 shillings or roughly $1. In April of that same year, the company changed its name. Opibus, with its unmemorable Latin roots, became Roam, simpler, punchier, easier to say in Kikuyu and Swahili and English, a brand made to sit on the tank of a Nairobi taxi, not on the door of a Silicon Valley corporate presentation. In March of 2023, Roam opened its factory, 10,000 square meters of production space off Mombasa Road, about 10 kilometers from central Nairobi. The nameplate capacity was 50,000 motorcycles a year. President William Ruto came in person to inaugurate the plant. The photographs from that day still hang on the walls of the Roam Park entrance. This was no longer a workshop. It was a factory, and it was a factory in Kenya, not in China. 2 months later, in May of 2023, Roam launched a solar-powered charging and battery swap network called Roam Hubs. 20 shillings an hour to swap, 150 shillings for a full recharge. A rider could roll into a Roam Hub, hand over an empty pack, take a full one, and be back on the road in minutes. The hub network was small at first, a few dozen locations. But it was the platform on which every future Roam motorcycle would rely. And then, Roam solved the finance problem. In April of 2024, Roam announced a partnership with M-Kopa, the pay-as-you-go finance company that had already put millions of solar home systems into East African households, and with Bolt, the European ride-hailing platform. The 3 companies together offered a Roam Air to any Bolt driver in Nairobi on 25,000 shillings down and daily payments of about 500 shillings for 24 months. A boda boda rider could now own a Roam Air in daily installments for less than what he was already spending on petrol. That was the pivot that made the whole thing work. On the 14th of February, 2024, 7 years after Filip Lövström had first landed in Nairobi with 2 duffel bags, Roam closed its Series A, $24 million, 14 million in equity, led by Equator, an Africa-focused climate technology fund. 10 million in debt from the United States International Development Finance Corporation. Other investors included @1 Ventures, TES Ventures, Renew Capital, The World We Want, and One Small Planet. It was, at the time, one of the largest financing rounds ever raised by a Kenyan hardware company. The capital ran into every part of the business at once. Roam expanded the Roam Hub network. It scaled production. It signed pilots with DHL for last-mile parcel delivery. It signed a fleet contract with Greenspoon, the online grocer, to run electric delivery routes across Nairobi. It kept iterating on its bus product, the Roam Move electric shuttle. It kept upgrading the Roam Air, and it hired. By the middle of 2025, Roam had about 150 employees across design, engineering, and production. About 40% of them were women, a number Roam highlighted deliberately because it was almost unheard of in East African heavy manufacturing. In June of 2025, a reporter from Tech Cabal, the African technology publication, toured Roam Park. The factory was about 36% built out. 12 to 15 motorcycles a day were rolling off the line. The nameplate capacity of 50,000 a year was still aspirational. The immediate reality was closer to 4,500, but the machinery was working. The apprentices were welding. The battery packs were being pressure tested. It was, for anyone paying attention, an unmistakably real manufacturing operation, running in the geography that Africa's electric vehicle sector had spent a decade being told could not manufacture anything. In May of the same year, Roam disclosed quietly that its revenue for that single month had grown by more than 500% year-on-year. The company had crossed some kind of inflection curve. Around the same time, the Financial Times of London named Roam Africa's fastest-growing electric mobility company. Fast Company placed it on its list of the world's most innovative companies. The Earthshot Prize had already, in 2022, named it a finalist. The recognition, at last, was catching up to the work. Which brings us back to the ride. On the 5th of October, 2025, Michael Gituka set out from Nairobi on a single Roam Air. 9 days later, on the 14th of October, he arrived in Addis Ababa. 1,600 kilometers, powered from a portable charger. Timed, precisely, to arrive on the eve of Africa Electric Mobility Week, the largest annual gathering of electric vehicle policymakers and operators on the continent. Ethiopia's fleet of electric vehicles had grown from 45,000 units in 2024 to 115,000 units in 2025. The Ethiopian government had banned the import of new petrol vehicles. It was targeting an 80% electric share of new vehicle registrations by 2030. Roam's message, riding into Addis on its own machine, was that the manufacturing partner for that transition should be Kenyan. A month later, on the 8th of November, 2025, Roam did something else that no serious African hardware startup had ever done. It opened its pre-Series B round to retail investors. Anyone in Europe, from as little as £10 could buy a share of Roam Electric through the Crowdcube crowdfunding platform. The target was $15 to $20 million. The larger institutional participants remained private, but the message was clear. The next generation of Roam shareholders would include, alongside Silicon Valley climate funds and development finance institutions, ordinary retail investors from across Europe and Africa. And on the roadmap for the middle of 2026 is a longer ride still. 4,730 kilometers. From Kigali to Beira on the Indian Ocean. Across 7 countries. If the first ride was a proof of concept, the second is a proof of continent. In 2017, 2 Swedish students walked into an unmarked Nairobi warehouse and started converting safari trucks. 9 years later, they run a factory that produces the only mass-market electric motorcycle designed and assembled in East Africa. They have partnered a European ride-hailing giant with a Kenyan finance company to put their machines under boda drivers who could never have afforded them. And they have ridden one of those machines 1,600 kilometers quietly up the length of a continent to prove that the future of African transport can be built inside Africa. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.